I tried with everything in my being for
Yeah,
decades and decades to make it work. And I finally concluded that I just couldn't make it work. And I
yeah,
thought, whose fault is that? If is it my fault for not trying hard enough?
yeah.
I cannot say that I didn't try hard enough or didn't do enough for God, as
Mm,
it were. So where was the God of the Bible? Where was this God? And there's so much at stake.
yeah,
Stakes are so incredibly high.
yeah,
Why didn't it work for me? Why didn't it work for so many other people who did
yeah.
try so hard?
Okay, so we're ready to roll.
Yeah.
This is Frank Schaefer, and you are listening to and or watching In Conversation with Frank Schaefer, which is my podcast. And today I have a friend who's written a book called Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, How Bill Gothard, Church and Family Taught Me Christianity Doesn't Work. And that is by Clint Heacock, PhD. Here's the book. And I read it on Kindle because that way I can cut and paste quotes that I want to get into with my guests. So let me read the rest of this boilerplate here that our producer, Ernie Gregg, has put here for me, which will give you a proper introduction. So my guest is Dr. Clint Heacock. Clint spent years pursuing the victorious Christian life, in quotes, he had been taught to expect. He watched haplessly as the rigid interpretation of Christianity taught by Bill Gothard, who we will introduce to listeners who don't know who that is, inflicted severe damage on his family. He graduated from Bible college, served in pastoral roles, and earned 2 master's degrees and a PhD in theology while still searching for that supernatural level of living promised in the New Testament. Clint is the author of Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, How Bill Gothard, Church and Family Taught Me Christianity Doesn't Work. And this is In Conversation with Frank Schaefer, as I mentioned, and I'm asking you to please subscribe right now on YouTube to In Conversation with Frank Schaefer, on Spotify and Apple Podcasts to my It Has to Be Said commentary pages, and to my Substack, It Has to Be Said at frankschaefer.substack.com. You can also follow my new project, which is a book called The Gospel of Zip at thegospelofzip.com. Two things about my new book, and then we'll talk about Clint's book. First of all, it goes on sale on Amazon on November 1 as both a book, a paperback, and a Kindle book. And it also is free because on that same day, the entire 8 hours with me reading it out loud, professionally filmed, so you can look at my face and or just not look at my face and listen to it as a free audiobook will be available. So we're doing everything we can to spread the word as widely as possible. If you want to buy a book, that's good. And if you want it free, that's good. And maybe you want to do both. The end of discussion of my book. Now, let's get back to Clint's book here, Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People. And Clint, just before we get into it, of course, you and I are friends. We've known each other. You've interviewed me about half a dozen times over the last 4,
Hmm.
5, 6 years. I forget when we first talked. You live in Wales and you are close to a football team in the British sense of the word that I follow. Welcome to Wrexham, the program everybody watches. You go to those games, which puts you into a special category with me. So I'm going to be very nice about your book because I'm still waiting for
Oh,
that, you know, tickets to the game if I'm ever in the area.
oh
Um,
yeah. We've talked about that before. I
we
said
talked about it
you've got
before.
an open invite. I've got a spare room. My house is 10 minutes from Wrexham City Center, so yeah, football grounds are right there.
And this is,
Anytime.
yeah, and you're absolutely unique. I don't know anybody else that can say something like that. And I would rather get tickets to a Wrexham game any day of the week than go to the World Series or anything else because I followed their whole thing through the documentary series that I think a lot of people may follow. So that's your claim to fame. But other than that, you've written this book, which is also a biographical memoir, because of course you're not writing in theory here. This is a first person account of how Bill Gothard and other people affected you. So before we get into it, let's do a brief thumbnail of your life so people can understand where you're coming from. You're a PhD, kind of working backwards. You've been a pastor, um, and you left the evangelical background you grew up in. And we'll get into some of those things through quotes through the book that I'll be reading, and we'll talk about them. But just give me a quick blurb on yourself and the genesis of this book that I think came out about a year ago.
Yes, it came out September, almost exactly a year ago,
Yeah.
September, just a little bit more than a year ago, 2024.
So
Yeah, I wrote it.
give me a little background on yourself, your life, and where this book comes from in that life.
It's funny because I was working at a prison in North Wales, of all things,
Yeah.
teaching carpentry, and that's where I wrote most of the book, sitting in there on my lunch hour, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to start getting these thoughts out on paper, talking
Yeah.
about my upbringing, and that's the genesis of where it started inside a prison in North Wales. I wasn't a prisoner, but I could
Yeah.
leave at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But it was basically it's my life story, but from a very obvious point of view, talking about how I was raised in this fundamentalist Christian bubble, and it was all so
And where was
normalized.
that happening since we've talked about Wales? You're from the States. So where were you when you were being raised in this
That
bubble?
is true. I was raised just south of Seattle, Washington.
Okay.
So I grew up in Washington State. I lived there all my life. Then I moved to Portland to do, studies, and then from there moved over here to the UK. I've been here 20 years.
Yeah.
But basically, yeah, so I grew up in the Seattle, Washington area, and this was a Church of Christ that I was raised in, just a bog standard sort of, typical evangelical slash fundamentalist church in the Seattle area. And yet now that I realize it, back on it as an adult, those things that were also normalized were really messed up.
Yeah.
And the way I wrote the book, the feedback I get from people is they say, we just go on the journey with you because I wrote it very uncritically as
Yeah.
I saw it as a kid. That's how I believed it all was true,
Yeah.
and I never questioned it. And
Yeah.
that's the way it was. Nobody else around me questioned it either.
Because Bill Gothard figures in here, give me another brief thumbnail on who Bill Gothard is for the many people who thankfully have never heard of him.
Well, unfortunately, a lot of people have heard of him and have
Yeah.
even now, patterned their families, their marriages on his teachings, even though he's basically been disgraced. It came out a few years ago that he had credibly sexually abused a number of young women at his headquarters. I think it was outside Chicago.
Well, give us some dates because when you were raised, your parents were not involved with Bill Gothard through all your childhood. It was sort of a
That's
bit of a
true.
later development. So give me that process of being raised within a fundamentalist community. Now they become involved with Bill Gothard. How did that change your life? But in the middle of that, you still need to tell us who he is.
Okay, well, maybe I'll tell who Bill Gothard was slash
Mhm.
is.
Yeah,
He founded an organization at that time when I was a kid called Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts,
right.
later changed to Institute in Basic Life Principles or IBLP. Now, those that have seen the series Shiny Happy People, season one, season two, that's why I named the book Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People to play
Yeah,
off of that, because that's about the Duggars, and they were, of course, were influenced massively by Bill Gothard's. They were kind of the poster family for the
yeah,
Gothard system, if you will. But basically, Gothard was one of many actually who built empires really
yeah,
on child rearing, parenting, marriages, and family in the context of the late 1960s all the way through the 80s. A lot of that was in the context of a lot of societal upheaval. So he was answering questions that a lot of parents were worried about, seeing these hippies and people dropping out, anti-Vietnam War protests and all that. And they're thinking, wow, how can I make sure my kids don't grow up to be like dropouts
yeah,
and losers and whatever. Here comes Bill Gothard along with someone like Dr. James Dobson. These are familiar figures kind of coming out around the same time.
sure.
And they're offering all this sage advice from the Bible. And people are grabbing onto it and saying, yeah, I want to raise my kids and I want to pattern my marriage according to what seemed like solid biblical principles. And he,
Yeah.
he put on seminars. Tens of thousands of people hung on his every word. My parents went every single year in the Seattle Center. I started going when I was 13, so that was the context
Yeah.
in which I was raised.
And give me just a thumbnail of where, let's just say you and me are still, because we're not, but let's just say for the moment, you and I are traditional evangelical Christians right now. We got saved at a Billy Graham crusade, or maybe came to L'Abri and talked to Francis Schaeffer, and we're just straight up evangelicals. We're not following Bill Gothard or any of these people. Just from the traditional evangelical point of view, how did Bill Gothard depart from, change his emphasis from that? Because you and I both know that he could be criticized from a general kind of humanistic point of view, but also a classical, he departed from what you would call classical evangelicalism, which did not put one guy in charge, nor give you 1,000 rules to follow. or this kind of dictatorial idea of who you marry, how you raise your children. So let's first start with how, and then we're going to get into the book, but how Bill Gothard embroidered upon and then finally departed from just standard evangelical Christianity. And then we'll put him in context with your book.
Well, the ironic thing is, I would say at the time, nobody would have considered him departing from anything. He was
Sure.
considered straight up, like I say, boilerplate Christianity,
Yeah.
Orthodox evangelical Christianity, because
Yeah.
his was, he had, I call it like an evangelical prosperity gospel, essentially.
Hmm.
Follow these rules, these simple rules, and his whole thing was about proper submission to authority
Yeah.
and being underneath the umbrella of God's authority and submitting to the authorities above you. And that's all based on biblical
And
principles.
that was a very patriarchal view of everything
Yeah,
as well.
absolutely. Your marriage is
Yeah.
patriarchal. The husband is the head of the home and the family. What he says goes. Yes, he should listen to his wife for advice and things like that. However, the final word is the husband's. And that's again all
Yeah.
based on Paul's teachings in the epistles. So you can find all these things in the
Yeah.
Bible.
Yeah.
It's just that I would say, and well, it's filtered into evangelicalism. So
Hmm.
it's kind of like people could say, well, I don't know who Bill Gothard is or was,
Right.
but his teachings are very influential because a lot of his material is used in Christian homeschooling
Sure, even
contexts as
today.
well.
And of course, where he
Yeah,
became typical was that, he just had his personality cult was on a bigger and more developed scale. But you could have said the same thing
yeah,
about Bill Bright and Campus Crusade. You could have said the
sure.
same thing about Labrie and my father, Francis Schaeffer, or even the Billy Graham Crusade people. It was always about the big man at the top of it. Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell,
Yeah, they were empires.
and continues to this day. And the empires they built, Paula White, whispering
Yeah.
in Trump's ear today, it's always about those people. And of course, um, that itself is a departure from the ideas of classical Christianity that are supposed to be about Jesus, not
Mm.
your local guy. But that's, more the theory than the practices you and I know. So let me get into the book. I've marked a couple passages here that I'm going to read, and I'm going to start with one that is from later in the book. I think actually this is from your afterword. If Christianity is the one true religion, then why do so many people, just like me, yearn for an assurance of their faith that they cannot find? I always struggled with the fear that I might lose my faith, becoming one of those blackened coals Pastor Jerry pulled out of the fire at summer camp. Others can blame poor pastoral leadership, bad theology, misinterpreted Bible verses, and so on. But ultimately, these are all excuses for a silent, hidden God. I concluded that God should have been more invested in
Mm.
helping me succeed. Now, that's toward the end, that's at the end of your book, but I think it's kind of an interesting setup for what we're going to be talking about. It sort of sums up the book in a way. So let's
Hmm.
just start where you ended, and then we're going to go back to the beginning, and I'm going to take people through your chapters with a quote from each that we can unpack and talk
Yeah,
about.
we
So
can dig
unpack
into.
your final statement there, and then let's go back through the book.
Well, it's ironic, I would say you have to read the book to get to that
Well,
point.
obviously, but we're promoting your book, so we
No, I
have to.
know. What I was gonna say is that the way I wrote it, and it's my true story. I tried with everything in my being for
Yeah,
decades and decades to make it work. And I finally concluded that I just couldn't make it work. And I
yeah,
thought, whose fault is that? If is it my fault for not trying hard enough?
yeah.
I cannot say that I didn't try hard enough or didn't do enough for God, as
Mhm.
it were. So where was the God of the Bible? Where was this God? And there's so much at stake.
Yeah,
Stakes are so incredibly high.
yeah,
Why didn't it work for me? Why didn't it work for so many other people who did
yeah.
try so hard? That's kind of the conclusion I came to. It's like I've tried to make it work for decades. No one can say I was not a true Christian. I was
Sure,
100%. I mean, I
sure.
went to Bible college, seminary. I did a PhD. I was a pastor. I was a Bible college teacher for over 20 years.
Yeah,
I wasn't a slacker. I put everything into. I studied Greek and Hebrew, and I mean, I did everything. I preached. I taught
yeah,
others how to
yeah.
do it. It wasn't for lack of effort.
Well, it's interesting because when you go back, sort of start at the beginning of this and get into some of the early passages, I'm going to read a couple things and then ask you to explain each one in terms of telling your story. So let's get something really, really early in the book where you're telling the story of basically thinking that maybe the second coming had occurred. And of course, I written memoirs as well, like Crazy for God. And I think I actually have a passage in one of my books which mirrors a similar concern. Whoa, man, what's going on? He asked with a look of concern on his face. Everything okay? You seem upset about something. What's up? I tried hard to think of the best way to calm down and explain my fear that I had missed the rapture, but there was no way I could make my non-believing relatives understand that a history-changing supernatural event had just occurred. Okay, in terms of people who don't share your background, they would read that as if it was from another planet. They would not get
Yeah.
what you're talking about. So let's pretend one of them is right here with us, and they're saying, what is this about? The rapture, the whole bit. And I'd like you to do two things: put it in the context of your memoir, but also put it in the context of the millions of people who have been raised in evangelical backgrounds, like Frank Schaeffer talking to you on this podcast, who one line into your story not only gets it, but has a deja vu, you know,
Mm, we've all
back
been
in
there.
time. In other words, I can picture the moment when I was with Jimmy Hughes in Chalet Beausite, part of the Labrie community, and we flushed the toilet to see if the water had turned to blood, because this would be a way of knowing if Jesus had come back,
Yeah.
because
Signs
there
of the
was
end
nobody
times.
over in the chalet and they had all gone off on a
Yep.
picnic or something, and we couldn't find anybody. And Jimmy Hughes and I were sort of half joking. We were about eight, but not totally. And so it was like,
Yeah.
well, maybe the second coming came. Nobody's over there. They all should be there. So I don't need the passage explained to me, but a lot of people would. So let's just
Somebody
unpack
does.
that a little bit. And that also will give an insight into the kind of indoctrination at a very early age where you're thinking about stuff like this.
Yeah. Well, this is relevant to the minute because just what was it, 23rd, 24th, 25th of September, just a few weeks ago, as we're doing this recording now, there was a
Yeah,
pastor, you probably heard this on the news, a pastor in Africa, it might have been South Africa, an African pastor predicted that Jesus Christ was going to return to earth and take all Christians to heaven with him.
sure.
And people all over the world
Yeah,
panicked. Some were like, I gave my car away. I quit my job today. I sold
yeah.
everything. I'm leaving tonight. It's still a thing, even to
It's
this
still a
very
thing.
day.
And of course,
It
you
just happened a
remember
few
all
weeks
these
ago.
names of people I met in my childhood who would come through my dad's evangelical personality called commune called Labrie Fellowship. Hal Lindsey, who wrote a book called The Late
Yep.
Great Planet Earth. And the funny
Yep.
thing is that in any decade, you would always find an equivalent of this African pastor saying, today's the
Hmm.
day, or this is the year, or
Yep.
Russia is
Given a
Gog and
date.
Magog, or Iran is, or Israel's back. And so, after the Six-Day War, and every time there was an event that remotely tied in with some sort of biblical prophecy,
Hmm.
there was a guy like this. So
Yep.
he's
There's
just the
always
latest.
somebody.
If you've been around as long as you and me have, we can think of dozens of examples.
88 Reasons Why Jesus is going to Return in 1988. Millions bought that book. And guess what? He didn't return. But that's essentially the belief that without any warning, Jesus
Right,
will call all the faithful Christians across the world
right.
instantly snatched up out of their cars, from an airplane, from their places of work, from their houses, wherever they are, and fly up through the sky to be with Jesus in heaven. And the rest of us who are not Christians will be left to face these
Well,
horrible
and the most
tribulations and all that.
famous iteration of that was well, there was Hal Lindsey, but then there was, the one that got made into a movie and all the rest, and
Oh
uh,
yeah, well there's a couple Left Behind. There's the
the
Left
whole Left
Behind series.
Behind series became a thing.
Yeah, Hal Lindsey or not? What was it? LaHaye, Tim LaHaye.
Tim LaHaye, who I knew,
But
and his wife
yeah,
Beverly, they did a whole thing. And here, I mean, I know this is a little bit down a rabbit hole for you and me, but let's just take 2 minutes and talk about a mentality that is proved wrong again and again and again, because none of these books ever
hmm
come true. None of the prophecies come true. Whole TV
yeah,
shows based on getting ready for this. It happens, nothing happens. And yet, how does it go forward? I mean, this is kind
yeah.
of
Why
like
does
the
it keep
doctors
happening?
in the 1950s saying that Lucky Strikes were good for your throat. Then they're proved wrong. And eventually, the American Cancer Association says, all those commercials you used to watch where doctors are telling you smoking's good for you, they were all wrong. And there's
Yeah,
kind of a point of, okay, that was then, but we don't do that anymore. But with the evangelical community, it doesn't matter how many people sell millions of books that are totally proved wrong or have these insane prophecies.
yeah,
Let's talk a little bit about the psychology of a movement that never corrects its blatant, glaring, time
yeah.
dated mistakes.
Well, the best book on that I would say is a book called When Prophecies Fail. And
Yeah.
it's a book, it's the authors that I think they were psychiatrists or psychologists. They basically discovered the idea of cognitive dissonance and is a whole story about how they infiltrated an alien cult. I think it was
Yeah.
in Chicago in the 50s. This woman was predicting the end of the world, and she gathered a huge following. And of course, it didn't happen. The saucer people didn't come down and snatch the faithful up, and the world wasn't destroyed. What they
Right.
found was every time a prophecy fails, and it's proven to be false because it doesn't happen,
Yeah.
it doesn't deter the vast majority of followers. In fact, they tend to double down a lot of times and
Yeah.
will dig in. You see this in Jehovah's Witnesses. How many times have they predicted Armageddon and it's never come to pass? 1914,
Yeah.
1975. It's never, and yet there's still faithful JWs out there that will defend the organization. So just because a prophecy fails is no guarantee that the adherents won't dismiss it as like, oh, the whole thing's false. How many people predicted Trump was going to win in a landslide in 2020? Christian prophets,
Yeah.
and they were all proved wrong. And they turned around and said, well, actually, no, the election was stolen,
Yeah. So we
so
were
we
right, even
weren't
though we were
wrong.
wrong. Right.
God was actually, and we were at fault because not enough Christians got out to vote. That's what
Right.
was wrong. It
Yeah.
wasn't our prophecy that was wrong. So they spun it out to get out of it basically. But
Yeah.
according to the biblical standards, you're a false prophet. That if your prophecy doesn't come to pass, that's what the Bible says. You are a
Yeah.
false prophet because you
Let
said,
me
God told me.
we're talking about not so shiny, not so happy people. Here's the book. Here's another quote from a little later, and I'm dipping in quickly to all these because each one brings up a good topic. Looking back on that vacation Bible school, I recognize that it was likely the first of many similar experiences that contributed to my religious trauma syndrome. An elementary school child like me at 5 years old doesn't have the critical or emotional faculties to process intensive past messages like, quote, you will go to hell for eternity if you don't accept Jesus as your savior, end quote. This is especially true when the messages are recurring and delivered by influential authority figures. As an adult, I now believe that this type of terrifying religious indoctrination of children is a form of abuse. And I totally agree with you on that. But
Mhm.
again, for someone who doesn't connect with this community, they would have a hard time imagining something. And not just that someone would say that once, but this was a background noise of our entire childhoods.
Yeah,
And in my family, it operated in two ways. One, you will go to hell and burn forever if you don't have this and this and this and this. And so, how many times do you pray the sinner's prayer to make sure you're really saved because you're still worried that you didn't really become a Christian the first dozen times? But then the
thousands.
second one is in our family that was a missionary family, we had it laid upon us from early childhood. Literally, these are as early memories as I have, that the way you interact with other people will determine their eventual destination to heaven or hell. Because if the Schaefer family is not open and caring and kind and loving and is preaching Jesus at every given moment as a good witness to Christ, then if their encounter with us leads them to reject Christianity, then we're responsible not just for them not joining a church,
Hmm.
but potentially being lost forever because we didn't do our job in the way we answered the door when a guest came to the door or someone we talked to. So
Yep.
there was a kind of a double whammy. It's not just you may be lost if for some reason that sinner's prayer wasn't sincere, or you're a teenager and you masturbate. So what's that say about your quality of salvation? But even in early childhood, the way you interact with other people will determine their eternal destiny and
Yeah.
eternal damnation.
Huge.
So I know I've
Huge.
gone on at length, but again, I don't think people get this if you want to talk about it a little bit.
Well, I was going to say the quote that you led with earlier, when I ran next door to my aunt and uncle's house, it was literally the next door house when I came home, I think I was about 12 and nobody was home. That was the context. And I was convinced that the rapture had happened and I had been left behind. So the person I was talking to when you read that quote was my uncle Rick, and that was the
Yeah,
difference is that my cousins, Dan and Andy, I saw them as my evangelistic project. They were not
sure.
Christians. And so I heard a preacher talking about the book of Ezekiel, and the prophet Ezekiel is told by God in this book, if you don't warn the wicked man of his sin and he fails to repent and goes to hell, his blood will be on your
Sure.
hands. You
Yeah.
will be responsible. And I remember hearing a preacher at summer camp say that to us, 12, 13-year-old kids. And I'm thinking, I don't want their blood to be on my hands.
Yeah.
So I tried everything I could do to save them, like you're saying. It wasn't enough that I was afraid of burning in hell. I had to make sure they didn't go to hell either.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing is that, again, people don't get unless they've been in this if you take a step back and then another step back from that and look at the biggest and widest picture possible, of course, all this relates to a theology of a vengeful God.
Hmm.
As soon as you have that,
Yes.
then all this stuff, quote, makes sense because God is sending a significant portion from the point of view of evangelical Calvinist theology I was raised on, the majority portion of the human race will burn forever because few are chosen. It says right there in
Hmm.
the Bible, few are chosen. And so you're part of the lucky few. You hope, you test yourself. And of course, this is a theme in your book. But the idea of a God that is going to create and then at the same time torment for eternity the majority of humanity, the most people that have ever lived. And there's these few who have been chosen and called, and then they have to keep proving the fact that they are, quote, saved. Obviously, everything else is a footnote because if that is who the eternal Father is, then it's no wonder that you're getting thrashed and spanked and capital punishment is part of our system. Corporal punishment is part of the system. And I don't think people get that. In other words, the theology of revenge on the lost then bleeds into everything because if you're not
Hmm.
saved or if you're not saving other people, this is the highest stakes game possible. Not we're talking eternity here. There's never enough punishment.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
How
again,
long
that
is it gonna
mentality
last?
is just so mind-boggling for a child.
Yeah, it's baked into the whole thing. So that little blurb you just read, I went to vacation Bible school. I was 5 years old, and
Mm,
I was literally scared straight. I went home on the Friday night when they said, if you don't believe in Jesus, you will spend an eternity in the flames of hell in
yeah,
conscious torment for. I was 5. I
yeah,
ran home and I said to my mom, "Am I going to hell?" And
yeah,
she said, "Well, do you believe in Jesus?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I guess I do. I mean, I was 5." She
sure.
said, "Well, you're fine. Nothing to worry
Yeah,
about."
yeah,
So that allayed my fears for a few years until I saw the movie A Thief in the Night, which was the
yeah,
precursor to the Left Behind series you mentioned. That was in
sure.
the 70s. There was a whole series of films. That movie was the one that prompted me to get baptized for the first time when I was 10. I saw
Yeah,
it 3 times and I was terrified that I was going to get left behind in the rapture. So that's that religious trauma syndrome.
yeah. Well, a little footnote here. Thief in the Night, I think, was produced by my friends at Gospel Films that later produced my dad's film series, How Should We Then Live, Whatever Happened to Human Race. They were the same people that made that. And they sort of brought that up like in, hey, our movies really get seen. We produced Thief in the Night. So,
Yeah,
little
that movie
footnote.
that movie scared a whole generation of kids. And what you were talking about earlier, that rapture anxiety, because not
Yeah,
only did I have religious trauma syndrome, it was rapture anxiety. There's a whole generations of
sure.
people now adults like you and me who were freaked out. I've heard so many stories. People
Yeah,
coming home to an empty house just like I did, and no
yeah.
one's home, and they are
And they wonder,
panicked.
yeah, if
They
everybody's
hear a
gone.
siren, they hear something, and it just triggers them. Oh, the rapture. And I mean, how many people were triggered just the other week over this
Well,
guy,
you're saying maybe I
predicting the
got
rapture?
left, maybe other people were taken. So your
Yes,
worst
right.
fear has been realized for a moment. We're talking about not
Yeah.
so shiny, not so happy people, how Bill Gothard, church and family taught me Christianity doesn't work. Here it is. I'm going to read another thing and we'll unpack this as well. By violating our church's strict evangelical purity culture code and losing her virginity before marriage, Valerie had forever destroyed her once promising future. Never mind that my parents, in their pursuit of fundamentalist purity for their children, had failed to offer her even the basics of sex education. So let's unpack that because obviously, human sexuality and proving that you're really saved by keeping the rules. Tell me a little bit more about Valerie. I read the book, but unpack that story.
Yeah. So this is my older sister, Valerie. In fact, she was just here a couple of
Yeah,
weeks ago. She stayed for a few weeks and we had a fantastic time as always. She comes over. She lives in the Seattle area now, but yeah, so she got pregnant when she was about 17.
yeah,
And it was all down to the fact that she didn't know that basically having unprotected sex could get you pregnant.
sure.
She Because again, my parents were thinking, well, why should we educate our children on sex ed like you read? Because
Yeah,
they're going to remain virgins until they're on their
sure. We
wedding
just
night.
have to teach them this principle, and then
Yeah,
who cares about the mechanics of it?
yeah, exactly. So
What do you,
why even bother
yeah,
to explain, hey, if you have sex with somebody without, protection, you could get pregnant. Well,
yeah,
because our kids aren't going to be having sex, so we don't have to worry about it.
yeah,
So here Valerie gets pregnant, And then the cruelty, the shocking, they actually went in league with a Bill Gothard inspired ministry called, ironically, Burden Bearers, which was like an adoption
Yeah.
program organization. And they basically forced Valerie to give up her daughter for adoption to a
Yeah.
Christian family. And she had, had her, and she was basically taken out of her arms and whisked away. And that was, she didn't see her again till she was in her mid 20s, her daughter. They finally reunited decades later,
Yeah.
but that was the context. It was very cruel, and it was all about, we have to sweep this under the rug because my dad was an elder at the church. He couldn't handle the scandal, so he stepped down, he resigned,
Yeah.
and it was a big public tearful thing the day I was sitting there. I remember that vividly to this day, the day my dad resigned as an elder, and everyone gathered around to hug and pray for them, and but nobody was praying for Valerie, who was stuck in a foster home
Yeah.
more than an hour away, pregnant at a strange high school. She didn't know anybody, and that was how they treated her. But no one was praying for her, except maybe
Yeah.
for her to repent and come back to the faith.
Yeah, and your dad loses his position in the church because by extension, it's Paul's thing of you have to be a good
Hmm.
father and all the rest of it. And obviously
Yep.
he had failed, but she's just sort of swept aside as.
Yep. And they
Um,
had to sweep aside the embarrassing problem, and that's what they did. They shoved her in a foster home, in a Christian foster home, again,
yeah,
ironically, made her register at her own high school where she didn't know anybody, and she couldn't finish because she finally became too big. She was pregnant to fit
sure.
into the desks. So she never finished high school. She had to get her GED several years later, and then, yeah, I won't tell the whole story, but yeah, she was forced to
How
give up
has
her
she
baby
done
for
since, by
adoption.
the way? I'm just having read your book, I just want to know how she's doing.
Well, this is the funny thing. So her and her husband, Mike, they years later, they came back to the Lord. They became youth pastors, ironically,
Yeah,
in the very same church that I was raised in, which most of
yeah.
the story takes place in, this little Church of Christ outside of Seattle.
Mhm.
Then they got run out by ugly church politics, which
Yeah,
is a thing, which is actually a big thing in churches, and
sure.
have since lost their faith, shockingly, maybe not so shockingly. So this is one thing that Valerie and I have very much in common now.
Yeah.
She and I very much share our sort of ex-evangelical worldview, but it's been a long journey because there's
Yeah,
a lot of other
terrible and
things packed in
torturous.
there.
And
Yeah,
she is
very
she and
difficult.
and the funny thing is, in one way or another, every family that goes down this path usually has someone who is rejected in some way or forced to do something because they've, fallen. And of course, sexuality is a big one, but so many
Mm,
other things are as well. So I just want to jump from that to the next quote here. While many of my outward public behaviors were modeled after what the dedicated kids at church were doing, there were not so public behaviors I shared with other friends from church that were anything but spiritual. We swore and smoked cigarettes stolen from Valerie.
no, there she is
Uh,
again.
yeah, we tried to drink a little beer, but I couldn't stand the taste. I had my personal private behaviors as well. I always had a few Playboy and Penthouse magazines stashed under my mattress. I told myself I was in good standing with God since I regularly begged him to forgive me for my disobedient ways. And once again, you've nailed basically you speak for millions in this book,
Hmm.
not so shiny, not so happy people. I would just say anybody that has had a kind of an evangelical and or fundamentalist background, could be Mormon, could be Jehovah's Witness, could be certain types of Roman Catholic families. You are going to find yourself staring back at you like a mirror in not so shiny, not so happy people. The circumstances may be slightly different, but you've told a kind of universal story
Yeah.
where there are probably kids growing up in Africa right now in certain kinds of Pentecostal churches that could read your book, when they burn out 10 years down the road, 15, 20 years down the road. And you've described their childhoods too. This is international.
Yeah,
This is not
it
just
is.
America. So talk about
Absolutely.
that. Talk about the tension between just developing normally as an adolescent, with all the normal biological human urges we evolved to have, and the tension with how you're supposed to be. And of course, we've already gone there a little bit with Valerie, and
Yep.
and the solution was to kick her out and demonize her.
Yeah.
And now you're get into that a little bit for you, because obviously this book is told from your point of view. It's not just
Yeah,
about.
absolutely. It's like you said, it's normal teenage adolescent stuff. Kids watch porn nowadays, it's on Pornhub and everything else. We didn't have the internet back then, so we had magazines. And
Sure.
and ironically, The first time I even saw a magazine was from another Christian friend of mine at church who gave it to me, in the parking lot. Say, hey man, you got to check this out. It's a
Yeah,
Playboy magazine I found on the side of the road or stole from my uncle or whatever it
something.
was.
Yeah,
And that was it. Now, according to the Christian worldview, of course, pornography and masturbation are like huge sins. And
yeah,
and ironically, so many pastors struggle with it. This is something
yeah,
I found out when I was a pastor that I'd go to these pastors' conferences, and by the Sunday night, everyone would be confessing the fact that they're addicted to porn.
yeah,
Of course, they couldn't tell that to the church. They'd probably lose their jobs.
yeah,
So it's a major thing. But we have to cover it up, suppress it, hide it, and beg and beg and beg, pleading God to
yeah,
release us
yeah.
from this affliction. And that's what I did. So I was always conflicted because I couldn't stop because it was a normal teenage thing. I'm a typical red-blooded, American male looking at these women. And yet I knew it was wrong. I knew it was sinful. I knew it was wrong. I was horrible. I was trapped in this sort of never-ending cycle. And then I begged and begged thousands of times, God, please take this away
Sure.
from me. And he never did. Why
Yeah.
not? Why wouldn't he? If it was such a
And of course, you
grievous
can
sin.
repeat that with people who grew up gay within that.
Yeah,
They're begging
same
God
thing.
to not have feelings for women if they're a woman, or men if they're a man. There's a lot of people who spend a big chunk of their adolescent years
Yeah,
begging God to heal them from something completely normal,
yeah. It
and then
wasn't a
blaming
sin, actually.
themselves and castigating themselves, not realizing that actually they would speak for the majority of quote unquote Christian teens, gay, straight, whatever, who all are bent on the same thing. Dovetails well with my next quote that I'd like to dig into. Despite my initial success at quelling my feelings of concern, I began to feel uneasy about the possibility that my faith could somehow fade away. That couldn't happen to me, could it? Once again, I reassured myself that my salvation was secure. Hadn't I just gotten baptized? So you have quite a baptism saga. I only
Yeah.
got baptized once. My dad believed in infant baptism. I did not get rebaptized, but tell your baptismal journey story as a little footnote in here.
Yeah, the original title was going to be something like Baptism Third Time's a Charm or something like that, but we changed the title. I was baptized not once, not twice, but three times.
And what was that
And
about? Was this
it
your
was
parents or was this you?
this was me. I mean, this was me driving it because it all goes back to what you were talking about earlier, begging God, hoping that if things were going to work out, that I was going to have that victorious Christian supernatural life, the
Sure.
breakthrough. And I was raised in the Church of Christ, which teaches something called baptismal regeneration, which
Yeah.
means in order to get saved, you have to get baptized. That is what they equate with salvation, which
Yeah.
later I rejected that theology, but I didn't know that at the time. So I
Yeah.
went to my pastor when I was 10, that pastor Jerry. He was the head pastor of our church. And I said, I've seen this movie, A Thief in the Night, three times. I'm
Yeah.
terrified that I'm going to get left behind in the rapture. I need to become a Christian. And he turned around and said, well, then let's get you baptized. And
Again.
so I did. No, that was the
Yeah.
first time when I was 10.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then I tried for 3 years to make it work. It didn't work. Then I went to the next pastor who took over for Jerry. This was Pastor David. And
Mm.
I said, look, I'm failing as a Christian. I cannot make this work. And he diagnosed my spiritual problem as somehow the first baptism didn't take.
Yeah.
We don't know why, but it just didn't take. So let's
Yeah.
get you baptized for the second time. So I did that again the second time. And of course, that didn't work, but I tried. It wasn't for lack of trying. Then the third time, I was an adult, probably in my mid 20s. I was actually a youth pastor and a Bible college student by that point down in Multnomah in Portland. And I
Yeah.
got baptized for the third time
Yeah.
because then I was convinced I was already a Christian by then, but I still needed to get baptized. So I was driving the whole thing. No one was pressuring me. It was just
Yeah.
internal pressure. I felt like I was a failure, so I needed to make things right with God. It was like a transaction between me and God, and I was letting him down in some way.
Yeah. And of course, again, your story is not unique. This is the crazy thing
Yeah.
about your book. Not so shiny, not so happy people. And I know this sounds crazy, but this is a book, this is a memoir, and it's very well written and very readable and really great because of your journey. I mean, going and getting the PhD and doing the theology, you went to an extent that some people don't go. But
Yeah.
the
Most don't
essence of
go.
this book is the story of millions of people.
Yeah.
This is not a one-off. There are more people who've grown up this way that the media is unaware of or barely aware, and certainly doesn't get the details right. Let me reintroduce you. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Dr. Clint Heacock. Clint spent years pursuing the victorious Christian life, in quotes, he had been taught to expect. And then It didn't work out as planned, as the
Mhm.
story of three baptisms might indicate. And then he's written this book, which came out a year ago. And by the way, right now on Kindle, there's a special offer. So if you want to buy it there, it's sort of 97 cents or something today only.
Yeah.
But I would advocate buying the actual paperback and getting it. Let me do the boilerplate here a little bit. Besides what Clint is the author of, this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I'm asking you to subscribe right now to Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And to my Substack, It Has to Be Said page at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And you can also follow my new project, The Gospel of Zip, that covers right behind me here at thegospelofzip.com, which will be published November 1st and is also going to be free on that same date on YouTube, where I read all 8 hours and had it professionally filmed for people who don't want to buy a book and want to do it as an audiobook. Okay, not so shiny, not so happy people. I'm going to read another quote that will get us into another discussion here of what's in the book. In front of other Christians, I was as good as gold and thoroughly acted the part of a sincere and obedient believer. What I didn't realize at the time was that I was experiencing what psychologist and cult expert Dr. Robert J. Lifton calls, quote, doubling, which is the act of creating a parallel religious self alongside one's authentic self. I just find that fascinating. And again, I want you to unpack that because that's an amazing concept, and it's very important to your story, and it explains sort of how you try to survive this doubling thing. Tell us about that. I think that's just so fascinating and a
Yeah.
big part of your story, even sort of reading between the lines in other parts.
Well, in a nutshell, there are several points in the book where I try and describe what I believe are, cultic practices
Mm,
that I experienced, and that's one of them. Dr. Robert J. Lifton, his famous book is Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, which is, I would highly recommend that book. It literally changed my life because he describes 8 cultic practices that religions and controlling cults use.
yeah,
When I read his book, I realized, my God, I have experienced all 8 of these in evangelicalism.
yeah,
That shouldn't be. I never thought I was raised in a cult. I never thought I was a cult
yeah,
member. I
yeah.
was a good evangelical Christian. It was only when I started applying those models back to my life that I realized, wow, I've experienced
I
and
mean,
I've done.
let's stop for a minute and tell us what his models are, because let's dive in there a little bit down
I'd
that
have
rabbit
to
hole.
remember all of them, but he starts
Well,
out
just do
with
your best. Give us a thumbnail.
I don't know all 8, but things like what he calls mystical manipulation and milieu
Hmm.
control. So when you come into a church, let's say, for example, the it seems spontaneous, it seems free flowing, a move of the spirit. There's worship music and there's
Sure. Of
lighting. It's a package, but he says it's contrived. It's all carefully
course it
contrived
is. Yeah.
to guide you along this journey. And then he gets into things like sacred science, which is, let's say, the Bible. Every religion has its sacred science. You have
Yeah.
Dianetics, Scientology, or the Book of Mormon, or something like that. Every religion has its sacred science. So the Christians, they hold the Bible up as inspired, inerrant. Then you get into what's called the demand for purity, which is
Mm,
they put these demands on us which are
mm.
impossible to meet, like sexual purity. And then when we fail, the next step is what he calls a cult of confession. And
Yeah.
that is where you have to then confess your sin. So it's this never ending cycle of guilt and shame. And he talks about things like something called doctrine over person, which I talk about in the book, where
Mm.
your beliefs take precedence over personal relationships. So
Sure.
you can trash somebody by, quoting the Bible, shoving the Bible down
Well,
their
and
throat.
or sending your daughter off to a foster
Yeah,
care home because she had the temerity to get pregnant at 17
yeah,
and you've never told her about contraceptions. And let's say
exactly.
you had told her and she still got pregnant. Obviously, that doesn't change the inhumanity of that. I
Yeah,
mean,
and
you've seen that in your own
yeah,
family.
your doctrine takes precedence over personal relationships. So
Yeah,
if Valerie broke the law, so to speak, and sinned against God in the Bible, then you're completely justified in saying we can get rid of her. And that kind of goes into the last point of his model, which is the dispensing of existence, which is where someone who questions authority or pushes back or something like that, you can get rid of them. It's just basically
sure.
cult shunning. That's the same practices you see in various cults. People are disfellowshipped or shunned or excommunicated, and that's kind of what they did to Valerie. It was doctrine over person as well
Well, and
as
as you know,
dispensing of
because you and
existence.
me share this, Clint. We both sort of moved on and left. And the funny thing is, 2 minutes before my novel Portofino was published, and Evangelical started saying he's written a work of humor at our expense. And then, of course, it got
Mm.
worse because I wrote a memoir, Crazy for God, and I started talking about why I'd left the evangelical movement. All of a sudden, all these people who swore up and down that you were the most important person in their life, or they were, you know,
Hmm.
had been part of this, or they grew up in your home because they had been they're gone because you're now being absolutely shunned. So
Yeah.
sometimes I explain to people, and it's hard to explain. They're saying, well, what happened? Why did you leave? And I said, I didn't. I just said I'd changed my beliefs, and then the group left me.
Yeah. They
And
just
and,
went
and
somewhere else.
oddly enough, and something I've talked about elsewhere, but one of the few people who was a well-known evangelical person who actually stuck with me even more than some of my own family did was Dr. C. Everett Koop, who was Ronald Reagan's
Yeah.
Surgeon General. And the reason why is that after 9 years in public office, he got so much shit from evangelicals for not being evangelical enough. Like he wanted to fund AIDS research. And why would you do
Ooh.
that if you're a Christian? Don't you know who those people are, quote
Yeah.
unquote? That
Those
he was
people.
telling me, I understand why you left. And other
Yeah, I
than
get
Dr.
it.
Siebert Koop, there wasn't anybody else from the
Yeah.
people you'd heard of. Anyway, let me get back to your book. It's too easy to get down in the weeds here because I relate to too much of your book. So
Yeah.
I'm always going off on my own thing.
Well, I was
Dire
gonna say,
punishments, yeah, dire punishments awaited us if we broke the rules about listening to secular music. If my parents caught us listening to any radio station other than the local Christian one, we'd get an immediate spanking. So note, it was a corporal punishment for listening to the wrong thing. Speaking of the theology being more important than the person, I vividly recall when we were finally old enough, my mom would leave my sister Beth and me home alone while she ran errands. It was one of the first tastes of independence my sister and I experienced. Of course, we abused our newfound freedom to engage in, quote, sinful activities. The second mom drove away and we knew we were in the clear, we'd blast rock and roll, the rock and roll station on the radio. So, you have a little bit of a thing there. But again, for people who weren't raised in this, just explain a little bit because the flavor of this childhood is so different than a lot of people can identify with.
yeah. Well, we were raised, but a lot of people, my generation, again, maybe even now, no television in the house, no secular music. You only could listen to Christian or classical music. That was all we were allowed to listen to. And my parents did it because they thought they were protecting us from the evils of the secular world. That's what they were doing. It's not just enough to shape the child, you're actually breaking the child's
Yeah,
will. You
yeah.
are breaking their proclivity to sin. So it's more than just a spanking. Corporal punishment was used, it was a spiritual thing as well.
And
So that
Dr.
was why the
Dobson
immediate
advocated the
spanking.
same thing. Dobson
Yeah,
advocated the same
absolutely.
thing. You got to break the child.
Yeah, and that was why we were spanked hundreds, thousands of times over the course of, my probably from 8, 10 years old all the way up to when I was about
Sure.
13 or 14 till we just got physically too big to spank, but we were spanked thousands of times. And
Yeah.
it was a ritualized thing. This is interesting because I just interviewed two women. They've just come out with a book called The Myth of Good Christian Parenting. And I
Yeah.
realized in talking to them, there's again generations of kids that now adults just like me who were raised in this sort of ritualized spanking and child rearing context. So
Yeah.
I'm actually not that unique. I'm
No,
I'm
no,
just a case study.
unfortunately, you're not.
I'm
I
a
mean, we
case
all
study.
identify with this. When
Yeah.
speaking of which, I always ask all our guests, and I'm asking you too, stick with us when I sign off here when we're done, which won't be yet because we're nowhere near done. But I'm saying when it happens, and stay around and talk to Ernie because that would be a book we'd want to interview those authors about. So pass
Mm,
those names on because that's
yeah.
something we'd want to
They're
talk
really
to them
good.
about. Let me um, let me just read here something that you already referred to, but it bears repetition. In the days when A Thief in the Night and three equally terrifying films that followed in the series were being shown in churches, rumors and conspiracy theories, that's the word that I want to pull out here,
Yep.
swirled around the evangelical world. Many Christians firmly believed that the Antichrist was alive somewhere in the world. And the reason I wanted to read that, even though we've covered it, is the key two words here, conspiracy theories. We're living in a time of anti-vaccine theories, Pizzagate.
Yep.
There's so many, there's no point even going
QAnon.
into it. And they all are sort of, whether it's Kennedy's conspiracy theories about pharma and how science isn't to be trusted, it's all part of the same thing. But of course, having been raised in this environment like you were, we were
Yeah.
trained to believe conspiracy theories
Yeah.
ahead of anything that was in a newspaper or a science book or being taught in a secular school. Our conspiracy theories were the truth, and the truth was the lie. I'm 73 years old and I'm still trying to figure out why, everything like those experiments where they put glasses on you for a day where everything's upside down, you take them off and you still see it that way. It
Yep.
takes a lifetime to untangle. Just talk about the proclivity for conspiracy theories in this entire subculture.
Yep.
And that explains a lot about Trump's attraction to
Yep.
these people. The election was stolen, the thing. There's never enough of this shit because you're believing in something that simply isn't true. And so basically you have to explain everything else as a conspiracy theory because they've all got to be crazy because nothing you believe actually makes sense. And that's a brutal way to
Yep.
put it, but I think that's true.
The fact is, it's baked into so much of evangelicalism. I remember years ago, my mom sent me a bunch of papers when I was a kid. She apparently, parents do that, don't they? Keep your papers from when you were
Sure.
in fifth grade. So she sent me a stack of stuff from when I was in Christian school in fifth grade. And I went through this pile of stuff, and it was shocking. I went through one, it was on creation science. And there's a conspiracy theory right there when I was in fifth grade. And it
Yeah,
basically said something like, the truth is, God created the world in 6 literal 24-hour days.
sure.
Those godless, atheistic, evolutionist scientists,
Yeah,
they don't want us to know the truth. They don't want the world to know the truth, which
yeah,
is creation science. And so it's baked in, even a conspiracy theory like that. They
yeah,
don't want us to know the truth, which is
yeah,
God created the world. So I thought, as a kid in the year, fifth grade, I was
yeah,
being indoctrinated by conspiracy, and this was in the early 70s. So
yeah,
this stuff
sure.
is baked in. So along comes a guy like Trump and QAnon and other stuff. They're primed to accept it.
Hey,
Evangelicals,
they're speaking
unfortunately, are
our language.
primed.
They're speaking
Yeah,
our language. Just to change a detail or
exactly.
two. We've been hearing this since we were born.
Yeah, because the QAnon is nothing more than the satanic panic, which I lived through in the 80s and 90s. So QAnon is basically the satanic panic 2.0. I've done episodes on this with experts, Mike Rothschild and others on
Sure.
QAnon. And I studied it, I researched it, and I thought, this is the satanic panic. But I lived through Mike Warnke. I went and saw him live in the early 70s in Seattle. And he was talking about these nationwide covens of, satanic child
Yeah,
murdering
absolutely.
devil
And the weird thing
worshippers.
is, people
It was,
like Tucker Carlson are speaking that language now.
yeah, that's
He's
QAnon.
all into satanic. It's a satanic attack, and
Yeah.
the
The
whole argument.
Democrats are of the devil, and they're
Yeah,
demoncrats and all that. They're demonic, literally demonic. So
yeah,
that's the language that Mike Warnke was using back in the 70s. And I was listening to him at Calvary Fellowship in Seattle when I was a
mm,
kid, going, yeah, wow, this is huge, man. There's these secret underground, satanic covens murdering children and drinking their blood and having black masses and all that. And nobody
yeah,
knows about it because it's so well hidden.
yeah.
Even the law enforcement doesn't even know about it.
Yeah. But
That was
somehow
all
we know
bullshit.
because they must, they're evil people. You have an interesting thing in your book about, your dad making you mow the lawn for 4 hours and he's let it grow a foot tall while you were away at a camp or something. You come home, you have a big bust up, and, before
Yeah.
that, kind of, even though he's spanking you mercilessly and endlessly, you kind of idealize him. And then after that, it's kind of a point of departure. I don't want to get too far down a rabbit hole, but it's an interesting little story. Just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, the next chapter reveals why that happened. Because, yes,
Mhm.
I was his little buddy. We were super close, as you said. But what I reveal in the next chapter, I don't want to give too much away, but my
Yeah.
mom was basically poisoning me for years.
Which I found very interesting, by the way,
Yeah,
the way she was poisoning
insidious.
you against him.
Yeah, she was slowly dripping poison into my ear, turning me against my father. I think honestly she was jealous of the fact that we were so close.
Yeah.
And she couldn't handle that. So she came up with a way to destroy that relationship, which she did.
Yeah.
She turned me against my dad, and then eventually we fell out over, yeah, I came home from camp. I'd had a terrible week at camp. I didn't have any friends there, all the rest of it. The minute I walked in the door on Saturday afternoon, shattered,
Yeah.
tired, exhausted, my dad says, "Oh, good thing you're home. Now go mow the lawn." And we had
Yeah.
this huge argument. I couldn't believe how tone deaf he was. But of course,
Yeah.
it was a buildup for years of all this stuff, going on. So there was
Well, and
even
basically you're
that.
going to do what he says, even though you're a
Yeah.
big kid now, or he's gonna whip you again, spank you again.
Yeah. And I was, and it does go back to the Bill Gothard thing because what my mom was telling me was your dad is a failure as a father, as a husband, as a
Hmm.
spiritual leader. He is not taking the role that God wants for him in this
Right.
family. So
Right.
even that goes back to he wasn't following biblical godly advice
He
for
wasn't
what I
adding up to the thing.
yeah,
Just
so
to,
my mom was unhappy, you know.
yeah, not so shiny, not so happy people. How Bill Gothard, Church and Family, taught me Christianity doesn't work. Clint Heacock. Okay, so here it is. And I'm going to quote something because we just mentioned Gothard, and now we'll get into that a little bit more. We've talked about him before. The foundation of Gothard's 7 principles for success was proper submission to God ordained authorities. And he promised that every obedient believer was under God's big umbrella of protection, blessing, and covering. Underneath Christ was the husband's smaller umbrella, followed by the wife's umbrella. The children were under all the umbrellas. Every individual is required to submit to the God ordained authority above them. Failure to submit meant big trouble. The diagram below, you have some diagrams in the book, demonstrates how this umbrella of protection concept worked. From Gothard's point of view, this entire concept was all a proven biblical construct. Okay, so let's just dive into Bill Gothard a little more because, once again, for people who weren't raised in this environment, to not know the name of Bill Gothard would be like you being out in the world having never heard of Sean Connery. You've never
Hmm.
heard of, whomever. This is just a household word, whether you knew who he was or followed him or not. If you were in an evangelical world, you knew Bill Bright because he was Campus Crusade. You knew Bill Gothard. You knew Billy Graham. And a lot of people knew my father's name, Francis Schaeffer. But Bill Gothard, even more so, because he had this vast network of people. And then a lot of scandal that you allude to followed. So let's go into his view of things and why that was so, just like we've talked about conspiracy theories already being in the movement before Trump, and so he was ready made for it. Let's talk about how Bill Gothard's idea of this umbrella plays into the moment in history
Yeah,
we're in, where a lot of evangelicals are like fine with an authoritarian regime that's getting rid of our big chunks of our democracy, like freedom of
this
speech
is
and
it.
freedom of the press. This isn't new. This was taught theologically by Gothard, if you want to put it that way,
Yeah.
before Trump arrived on the scene. And I'm not
Oh
saying
yeah.
Trump believes any of this himself, but he certainly had a ready-made group of people who had already viewed
Yeah.
democracy, freedom of speech, and all these other things, with a very jaundiced view, unless I'm mistaken. But go ahead and talk about this.
Well, that's it. You're exactly right. I would say if people have read Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes Dumais, that book basically summarizes your argument, what you just laid out. And that is that a guy like Trump is taking advantage of decades of conditioning. Christians have been conditioned by patriarchal leadership models within churches and seminaries and Bible colleges and elsewhere to accept that construct that man, a strong charismatic man, needs to be running the church and the family, the marriage. It's a patriarchal system. So you got now guys like Doug Wilson. Pete Hegseth is now a member of one of Doug Wilson's churches in Tennessee. Now he's now popularized the name of Doug Wilson, classical Christian school model. So this is baked into American culture now. Pete Hegseth is a prime example of what's going on. So this is all baked in. So yeah, you're right. It's decades of conditioning to accept strongman celebrity type pastors, guys like Mark Driscoll and so many others. And that's what's led to, in large part, so many evangelicals just unwittingly embracing Trump because they've been primed and conditioned for it. And Bill Gothard laid the groundwork when I was a kid.
He did lay the groundwork for it. I want to go to something else here and read from your book where you're saying making an example of, quote, a backslidden person or anyone labeled a troublemaker is an excellent way to enforce control of those who stay within the system. Witnessing the brutal example made of the excommunicated sinner, like your sister, that's me talking here, back to your book now, the others vow that this will never happen to them. As a result, they remain compliant and rarely, if ever, question those in leadership, the teachings of the leader, or how things are done within the group, despite possible abuse and exploitation that may be occurring. And again, you're writing about the quote
Yeah.
unquote Christian environment in which you grew up, but that could be a description of the Trump White House right now.
Yep. Or
I
any
mean, I'm
cult.
just going to go back to that sentence again. As a result, they remain compliant, speaking of the MAGA movement, and rarely, if ever, question those in leadership. For instance, when we say that vaccines for measles are no good and our children die because of it. The teachings of the leader are how things are done within the group, despite possible abuse and exploitation and or the selling of bitcoins and the money being made by the family.
Yeah.
That's not in your book, I'm adding it. That may be occurring. And again, there's no way to overstate this. When people would ask me, because I grew up in that environment, how could Christians believing that adultery is a sin and all these other things vote for Trump? It's like, so little about the movement.
Yep.
We were groomed from birth to vote for
Yeah.
Trump. It
Our
just
whole
was a
lives.
coincidence that it's him that came along.
Yep.
Unpack it.
Exactly. Oh, there's so much to unpack. Like you said, I mean, it's been like I said before, decades of grooming, conditioning, normalizing. You could apply this to any cult. That's the truth. You could say, oh, Scientology when L. Ron Hubbard was running it, and now
Sure.
David Miscavige. Any cult, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, you name it. The principles, the cult psychology and tactics are the same. And that's why I say what really got me going was probably 10 years ago. I was watching a series here in the UK where it was something like, Cult Week, and they had every week they had or every night they had a different cult that they were profiling.
Yeah.
And as I was watching about two or three or four episodes, I started thinking, wait a minute, this is a completely different, not even a Christian group.
Right.
Why are they sounding so similar to my experience? That's
Yeah.
that's really the genesis of this book is when I started watching that series, I thought, wait a minute, how can that be? These things I've all experienced in Christianity.
Yeah.
And I talk about like Dr. Robert J. Lifton's model, and you see that with the cult of Trump. It's funny, like I remember that when he was first president, how many times would he go out and say something absolutely indefensible and insane, just literally insane,
Right.
and then his spokespeople would go out and defend it, and it's indefensible. And
Sure.
yet, and they're doing it again in this new regime. And that's the dynamic you just said. They cannot push back, question, because if they do, it'll be the dispensing of existence. We've seen it with other Republicans who dared to stand up to Trump,
Yeah,
and they've been
absolutely.
booted out. And Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and some other people, they're gone. They're persona non grata now. They're not even part of the party.
Two things. I have a book club called It Has to Be Read, which is sort of a riff on my Substack page. It Has to Be Said. We want to make your book, Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, are a special October offering. We're in
Mm,
October, so that's like right now. Sorry,
yeah.
a day late and a dollar short, well, a year late and a dollar short, but we're doing it. So Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People will be a special October offering in our It Has to Be Read book club. I'm going to go back to another quote in your book. The reality was that my siblings and I lived in a dysfunctional, anxiety-ridden, fear-filled, hostile, and often unsafe environment. We were all required to act a prescribed and promised part for our church family. From the outside, our family appeared to be loving, godly, and wonderful, but that was far from the truth, especially for us kids. Now, we've talked about that, and we've been diving into this and talking about your sister and so forth. So just give me a couple of examples from your own life, and I can always, of course, give you some from mine of the disparity between the image and the reality. And of course, as you and I know, because we either know personally or know of evangelical quote celebrities, whether it's Francis Schaeffer, Billy Graham, or whatever, um, the fact and the reality are completely divergent. And in the case of the people who really aren't good people, not just misled, it's even further apart. But talk about your own life a little bit. Flesh that
Well,
out.
yeah, it goes back to we touched on this concept of doubling earlier, which we never really unpacked, and that is basically the idea of you got two parallel selves. Let's say you got your religious self and then your authentic self, your true
Mhm.
self. You
Yeah,
wear this mask. That's the religious self to fit into the group, and that's what gets you accepted in the
yeah,
church or the cult
yeah,
or whatever it is. Every cult member experiences doubling on some level, and
sure.
I experienced our family was doubling. It wasn't just me. So
Yeah,
we would present this. So we'd go to church and we were loving and wonderful. We'd all pull in the parking lot. Everything was great. However, what you didn't see was the 40-minute drive to church where
sure.
my mom was literally screaming at us over the back seat as we cowered in the back seat about how we were late coming out of the house and now we're going to be late to church and we're going to
Yeah,
disrupt the service. And I don't know. And then as soon as we pulled into the parking lot, she'd say, all right, now listen, wipe those tears off your face.
Yeah.
literally say that. We'd be like sobbing in the back seat, so terrified.
Yeah, wipe
But
those tears off your face. We're going to church. Be happy.
exactly. I
Not so
mean, and then
shiny, not so happy people. We did Melanie Brooks' book, A Hard Silence, in which she grew up in an evangelical family. Different story, same thing.
yep,
And her
same
father caught
concept.
AIDS from a blood transfusion, and he was an evangelical, good standing in his church, and he's actually a physician, and he got them to hide it for 20 years
Good Lord.
because he wasn't gay, but thought, well, it's the gay disease, and I don't want even to answer questions. So
Yep.
they're not only screaming in the car on the way to church, here's a huge, big, dark, mortal secret that they're hiding and can't share with anybody because it might not be good for the family's
Yep.
reputation and the Lord's work,
Exactly.
which of course is conflated with the image their father has or whomever. So we've done a series of books on this podcast by people who have some aspect of that story to tell. I just want to go to a quote here. The youth pastor seemed to be speaking right to me as he described a person who had once seemed close to God but had slipped away from the truth. Quote, "It happened through no fault of your own," he declared. Satan, quote, you're quoting him, "Satan doesn't want us to come to the light and see the truth. He and his demons are working overtime trying to steal those good seeds of the gospel from the stony ground of our hearts," end quote. This explanation seemed to explain why my first two baptisms hadn't taken hold. And then, of course, you've told that story, but it also applies to our political situation here. And that
Yep.
is, it's not that, Trump may not be who he's cracked up to be, or that selling billions of dollars worth of Bitcoins might not be what presidents are supposed to do. Let's just remember that, this is all just a satanic attack on God's big plan here that we don't fully understand.
Hmm.
Why God has raised up this adulterous, thrice divorced man, who, accused of rape, et cetera, et cetera. But forget all that for a minute. That's all this is spiritual warfare.
Yep.
Just go into that a
Absolutely.
little bit, your own example, but how does that play out? Because again,
Oh
like
man.
being groomed to accept conspiracies, there's a huge subculture that comes out of church backgrounds that has been groomed to expect and excuse any kind of behavior as long as it's seen as part of God's plan or spiritual warfare. And again, people from outside of our community do not get this.
Yeah, but that's biblical. That analogy
Yeah,
that I refer to, that context of that story was the night I got saved. And I mean, I got saved at that church in Seattle when I was probably 21, 22,
yeah,
listening to this youth pastor preach this persuasive sermon, and it all made sense for me, and I couldn't deny it anymore, and I got saved. But like you said, it was all in the context of spirituality. That's a parable, but that Jesus tells in the Gospels.
sure.
That this explains why some people don't, I guess, get saved or something. They
Yeah,
hear the gospel, they seem to respond, then they fade away, and then, well, it's because Satan and his demons snatch the seeds of the gospel from their hearts and the
sure.
soil, the condition of their heart. And then Paul talks about, he says, that people cannot see the truth of the gospel because they are blinded by Satan. They are
Yeah,
spiritually blind. And I
yeah,
can remember talking to so many people, trying to witness to them, and they didn't get saved. And I walked away from that conversation telling myself, well, you know, they're spiritually blind. I have to pray for them that the Holy Spirit will open their eyes so they can see the truth of the gospel. I
yeah.
can't do anything because this is actually a spiritual battle. So it's spiritual warfare is baked in to even it's baked into the Bible. Paul
Yeah,
talks
and the
about
flip
put
side
on
is
the
that,
whole
of
armor
course,
of God and everything else.
when you see it baked into the Bible, basically it's a ploy to make an excuse saying, look, if you question this is a satanic attack. Your question wouldn't be valid. If Clint Heacock and Frank Schaeffer walk away from the truth, obviously they've given into a satanic battle. They couldn't have any actual reasons, like, maybe
Yeah,
this isn't true.
yeah, valid
Here are
reasons.
reasons I don't believe this. Maybe
Yeah,
beating children, to get them right with the Lord isn't a good idea. This is all something else. Um, and of course, that's why I think, to me, the theology itself is so suspect in terms of what the Bible actually says, because you have a feeling of people saying, well, there'll be people who leave, so let's come up with a reason for that. We're not going to address the issue. So Frank Schaeffer or Clint Heacock aren't evangelicals anymore, not because they've asked them legitimate questions that never got answered, not because of the corruption in the evangelical church. They must be bitter. They must be angry. They must have been this. They must have been
yeah,
that. And then the biggest explanation of all is, well, they've listened to Satan. Um,
yeah. Well,
And
that's
that way you don't have to
yeah,
deal with the questions. You don't have
yeah,
to deal with what actually happened. You don't have to deal with Bill Gothard's sexual abuse of minors. You don't have to deal with what's actually happening in the Trump administration. Either you sign on to the whole thing or you've given in to a satanic attack. And again, unless you were raised in this, people don't get it.
Yep. Well, talking to those authors, I was saying about that book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of kind of dominoes clicked in place for me. They sort of penny dropped, as it were, because I realized they said it's not just that we can say now, oh, that was theoretical. So when I was a kid, Bill Gothard, James Dobson, and other quote experts were coming along peddling books and seminars and conferences to parents just like mine, but that was the first generation, and they
Right.
could make all kinds of promises. If you raise your kids this way, they will guaranteed turn out a
Sure.
certain way. They'll be godly. That's what the Bible says. Raise up a child in the way he should go. When he's old, he will not
Yeah.
depart from it.
Yeah.
That's what the Bible says. It's a biblical promise, and they leaned on those kind of things. But they said now we can no longer say this is no longer theoretical. We have
Sure.
millions of case studies to prove that it did not work. And I
Yeah.
say, I'm just one of them case study. You're a case study. And you can no longer say it's theoretical. We now
Yeah.
know millions have walked away from the faith as a direct result of the way we were raised and our experiences within the church. And that all goes, we're case studies now. So it's no longer a theoretical argument. Well, this might happen. No, this did happen
This
to
did happen.
generations.
Well, and we're in a very, and this is a weird analogy, but we're in the same position of the people who were raised in Marxist youth camps in the 1930s in Russia.
Yeah.
And then Stalin starves half his country to death and becomes a mass murderer. And at a certain point, it's not like, hey, this could work if we just got the details right. It's horrible. It's not
Yeah.
working. This is North Korea,
Yeah.
and
It
we've
didn't
we've
work.
experienced similar things in our own backgrounds. Okay, so one more time, not so shiny, not so happy people. How Bill Gothard Church and Family taught me Christianity doesn't work. Clint Heacock, PhD. Here's the book. It's our special offer in October. In our book club, it has to be read. And you please stay and talk to my producer, Ernie Gregg, for a few minutes about these guests that you had on, because we want to do their book too, or anybody else you
Yeah.
know of. And of course, this is an open-ended invitation to you to keep feeding us good guests that you interview or think we should talk to, because you know where we're coming from. And we will follow up with you again on anything you do, because Clint, you're one of the good people, and I really
Yeah.
enjoy and value your work. And thank you for your friendship interviewing me. And take care. And
Yeah.
please stay.
Thank you.
Attorney, real pleasure. This, as usual, good discussion with you.
Yeah. Thank you. Take care. I would just say really quick too, the Audible version, I did the narration of that if people want
Oh,
to get
good.
that. So
Yeah,
I've heard a
that's on
lot of good
Amazon as
feedback.
well.
That's the Audible version. Yeah.
So Audible and always read by the author is so much better than a reader. And
Yeah.
then that's on Amazon, and so is the book, and so is the Kindle thing, and you can get it for less than $1 right now if you go to Kindle. So hey, Clint, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Frank. Always good talking to you.
Always good. And you know what? I've got to admit, I hadn't read Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, because I am down to reading books for my podcast now. And I'm doing 2 or 3 a week. And basically, it's like I'm in school or something, and this is a required reading list. But I do prepare, and I really read the books.
I
So
appreciate that.
I
Yeah.
enjoyed it thoroughly. It's a really good book.
Thank you so much. I really
Talk soon.
appreciate
My
it.
honor, my pleasure. Talk soon.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.